9:19 exactly. This is News and Views right here on Salam Media. And next on the show is Professor of Political Economy at the University of Wits School of Governance. And we're going to be looking at the situation on the border of Russia and Ukraine. And the G7 countries who comprise France, Italy, Germany, UK, US, Canada, and Japan are warning of huge reprisals or massive consequences if Russia does in fact invade the Ukraine. So what exactly is happening there? Why is this playing out? Is it Russia wanting more territory, to gain more territory, or do they want to completely go in and take over Ukraine and get them under communist rule once again? Let's hear from Professor Patrick Bond. A very good morning to you. Welcome to the program.
Salam alaikum. It's great to be with you. And I should just say I'm now at the University of Johannesburg, not Wits. But the main question you're asking, it relates so in such an interesting way to an arc of chaos stretches from Poland, where there were attempts to put some NATO missiles against Russia, down through Ukraine. And you might know that at the bottom of Ukraine is the Crimea, which actually Putin did invade in 2014. And that led to him being thrown out of what was then called the G8, now it's the G7, clearly the Western powers, plus the multilateral institutions that they control. And then the arc continues, and Iran is part of it. They discussed the nuclear deal that has been sort of very frayed. Donald Trump broke that deal, and Joe Biden hasn't been as generous as his then Secretary of State, John Kerry, was in bringing Iran back into a deal, and they're offering less attractive terms to Iran. The arc of chaos continues into Pakistan, where Gwadar is under popular protest, thousands protesting, particularly the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the lack of good services. And then you go to Afghanistan, which remains chaotic. And then you continue really along that India-China border, where conflict has been extreme between these two BRICS powers, Narendra Modi in India, trying to defend the border against Xi Jinping as he sees it, incursions and attempts to grab land. And the most important probably is Taiwan on the very east side, where the U.S. Is threatening that if there's an invasion, there could be an all-out war. Wow, we're at a very critical point in world history. So this G7 meeting didn't resolve anything, but you're right to ask about Vladimir Putin. That might be one of the most interesting questions. Does he want to restore not communism, as you said, but rather the geographical terrain of the old Soviet Union? And his main worry is that Ukraine would be the base for the West, which has a more pro-Western government in Ukraine after 2014. And would they then use that as a basis for Ukraine joining NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to again threaten Russia militarily? You know, there are quite a few Russian speakers in the east side, and that's where in that Donbass region, there's a lot of tension, because some of them in that east side, like the Crimeans, they voted overwhelmingly, let's join Russia. So what a tense geopolitical situation, with South Africa luckily not involved in any way in any of these, except being part of the BRICS.
Thank you. We have our own problems to contend with. But that being said, Professor Bond, let's look at the issue around, Ukraine and Russia. You are suggesting not necessarily the issue around communism, but territory. So hasn't Russia got enough territory that they're still wanting to take over Ukraine? What is the attraction for them as far as Ukraine is concerned? We know as we speak, we are being told that there are approximately 70,000 troops now based in that area, Russian troops. We are also told by Russia that, well, rather not by Russia, US intelligence have assessed that Russia is possibly planning a multi-front offensive on the Ukraine, and as early as next year would probably have up to 175,000 troops on the ground.
It is worth worrying about, because some of the nationalist rhetoric from Russia suggests that they see a kind of greater Russia, to potentially include those Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. And to some extent, as you say, it's not really, it's a territorial concern because these were quite fluid territories in the past. As I say, Crimea had been part of Russia for centuries and then was given to Ukraine as one of the Soviet Union socialist republics as a sort of gift from, I think it was Leonid Brezhnev. But the real dilemma, I think, for Russia is that their population is shrinking, they have economic stagnation, dissent is rising, Putin's less popular. I think this is the kind of, drum beating and nationalist rhetoric that we often hear when governments are under a little bit of pressure and they want to, rally their masses. And there's the other big question, which is I think Russia isn't communist by any means. It's a very capitalist place now, but they're also sub-imperialist. In other words, they want to have a regional hegemony. They want to be the deputy sheriff, the way the U.S. is sort of the sheriff of the world. They can be deputy sheriff in the old Soviet Union territories. And in places like Georgia, they've had actual battles. Chechnya is a very hotly disputed part of Russia. These are sites where, let's say, the Russians feel that this is their territory. And part of it is economic, too, because, part of what makes Russia wealthy at the moment, at least the sort of fossil fuel wealth, which is actually destructive wealth, isn't it, because of the climate crisis. But they're trying to move a whole bunch of pipelines into Germany and sell gas there. Even as we're supposed to be decarbonizing, there's still this residual demand for Russian gas and oil. And so keeping any of these lines open, any border areas where the Russians feel sensitive that the gas pipelines might be threatened, they obviously want to have an economic and military defense. And I think that's part of what's going on with Russia in many places. We're seeing Rosatom and gas and oil companies and minerals companies moving across the world. We're also seeing Russian mercenaries. There's Russians in, for example, Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, next door to us, fighting Islamic insurgency until they were defeated and had to leave, and South African mercenaries took over last year. There's Russian mercenaries in Mali, in the Central African Republic. So yeah, this is a more militaristic kind of a period for Vladimir Putin, since he's probably in power forever until he dies. He's 69, and his sub-imperial agenda extends all the way to Syria, where he helped the Assad regime retain power against democratic opposition that was rising in the Arab Spring era. So I think this is a very dangerous man, and it's a tragedy that lives have been lost already, and that this turmoil is wasting so much military resources when so many Russians, are suffering economically.
Let's look at the issue. Let's look at the statement by British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. She has said that obviously Russia will suffer serious consequences if they do invade the Ukraine. Has this got to do with the 50% of the global GDP that these 7 countries are controlling, or in terms of the G7?
This is the last bastion of imperialist power, right? I mean, it's kind of like the old colonial powers plus the U.S., Canada, and so forth. So it's really the last attempt by the worst vestiges of Western power to control the world. And they don't do a very good job. As I said, they were the G8 because when, before Vladimir Putin, they were allowed in because Yeltsin was seen as pro-Western in the 90s. And then after the Crimea invasion or liberation, whichever you like, of 2014, Putin was thrown out. So the G7, including the host, which is Boris Johnson, this is a meeting that was just held in Liverpool, and Liz Truss, the foreign minister, that was Johnson's old job. Of course, they're going to sound more bellicose than usual. This isn't like, if you recall, the G20 is an assimilation institution that draws into the G7 an additional 13 countries, including Russia, China, and South Africa, and Brazil, and a few others. And it's a very interesting time to ask, are these multilateral power games effective? Because the biggest crisis of all, of course, is the climate crisis. And there, the G20, which includes Saudi Arabia, is just absolutely not interested in solving this crisis because there's just too much fossil fuel and industrial interests at stake there. And I think, therefore, the G7 will rattle sabers, and they'll do what they did in 2014. They'll put in boycotts. They'll put on economic sanctions of various kinds. the 2014 meant, for example, that the Crimea invasion, the World Bank and the IMF won't lend to Russia because the West will block that. And the extent to which assimilating Russia into the G20, into the IMF and the World Bank, because they were actually already funding increased capitalization of the IMF the next year, may then backfire. And, the big threat is that toss Russia out of the international payment system. They won't let Russians kind of trade in any way that involves the US dollar. And, Russia, those guys are very smart, and they may well have alternative systems set up, particularly with China, where they can do barter trade or non-dollar trade. So we'll have to see if they actually follow through in case there is an invasion. But I think we can all hope there won't be one.
You actually just preempted my next question, which was, what do you think is, apart from the fact that there would be economic sanctions placed on Russia, and you've answered that question, but in terms of invading Ukraine, what is the worst case scenario apart from economic sanctions? How do you think the rest of the world might respond? Or will they just kind of turn away, it's not my business situation?
Yeah, it's a very good time to ask that because of what Joe Biden just hosted, which was a democracy summit. He obviously didn't want either Vladimir Putin or China's Xi Jinping. So they didn't come. But interestingly, Cyril Ramaphosa, who could have showed up on a 10-minute Zoom call, right? That would have been very easy and quick just to, placate the West. He decided not to go to this big democracy conference. And in fact, his foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, made a little joke. What does the U.S. know about democracy? They've been supporting these dictators all around the world. I think very appropriately, joking about how can Joe Biden, with a straight face, hold this conference. So if Biden tries to put together a coalition of the willing, the way, say, George W. Bush did against Iraq, or the way they try to kind of put coalitions of pro-Western governments together, they may not find that they have that much support. Putin's been very clever at finding different allies. Whether David Mabuza, our deputy president, was in Russia a few, weeks ago to get himself better, whether it was poisoning or whatever disease. Zuma has been there for, antidotes to poisoning. Willy Mtunu from KZN. You have a kind of revolving door of politicians between Russia and South Africa, which gives them a bit of a support base here. But all over Africa, you find, unlike, say, the 1970s when there was a big, Cold War underway and Russia chose sides, for example, choosing the side of the Angolans and the Mozambicans against white South Africa and the West. It's a slightly different thing. It's based on, I think, a little bit more economic, there are gifts being offered all the time. And we've seen, for example, in Cape Town, a big Russian effort to try to map out the Antarctic for potential oil and gas drilling, very, very dangerous. We've seen, overtures from Rosatom. So I think that's actually the biggest dilemma for the West, that at a time when China's really made great strides around the world, China supports Russia wholeheartedly in all of this sort of, geopolitical tensions. The West may not find its old neo-colonial relationships, its purchasing of politicians. It's, Cyril Ramaphosa, a great example. He's a very pro-Western guy. But if he doesn't want to go to Joe Biden's democracy conference and his foreign minister has a laugh about it, then I think they have a credibility problem. And Donald Trump certainly hurt them, but Joe Biden hasn't been that great a comeback, has he?
My final question, I'm going to digress. It has nothing to do with G7 and Russia and the Ukraine. You touched on Afghanistan at the opening of the interview. Let's just go to Afghanistan for 1 minute. It seems as if the Western world has lost interest in Afghanistan since the American troops have pulled out. The country is on the brink of starvation. They do have lots of gold reserves and dollars held by the Americans, who do not want to release it to the new Afghanistan government. What's the state of play there? Can they do what they're doing? Can they hold on to the much needed reserves for the Afghani people to get back onto their feet?
Well, it's truly sickening, isn't it? Because I happen to know this case a little bit because the PhD supervisor in the committee reviewing my proposal was none other than Ashraf Ghani at the time. He was a young academic at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in the United States. And then he became, in the World Bank, a top official, and then than Afghani president. As you remember, in May, he fled Afghanistan, and they say he had over $160 million in U.S. cash on the helicopters, right? Yes. It was just outrageous. And that's the kind of, let me say, charlatan that the U.S. has promoted in Afghanistan. So, of course, they've got lots of their wealth abroad and reserves abroad, and the Taliban government isn't able to access. And, of course, the aid is only going to come in if the Taliban, sort of toes the Western line. What a mess. Look, the best hope for the Taliban is that the rumored rare earth minerals that will help in this so-called green economy, the new economy, are found in abundance, and therefore China moves in to take over those, and that's what the West is worried about. As you know, this is a tumultuous region between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kashmir, both held by India and Pakistan. Wars breaking out all the time. Islamic extremism not by any means settled there, and it's a very interesting dilemma, isn't it, for Western geopoliticians. The first of these was called Halford Mackinder in the late 19th century. He said, the whole future of the world depends on this Central Asian landmass. So whatever happens in Afghanistan will have enormous implications for everywhere else. I suspect it'll be China taking on a friendly and perhaps later neo-colonial role, mainly to get those minerals, but there's plenty of gas lines that go out to Pakistan and out to the West as well that are at stake. So we'll have to watch that.
Okay, and that's really, thank you indeed for your insights. You have a wonderful day, and thanks once again. 9:36 exactly, news and views on Salam Media. We will be going for an ad break, and when we get back, we're going to be talking with Rahima Mahmoud. She is the Executive Director of the Stop Uyghur Genocide Campaign.